1787. The Dnieper River. The world itself seems to hold its breath, silenced by the sheer audacity of the spectacle. The air, thick and humid with the promise of a southern summer, carries a strange symphony of sounds. The rhythmic splash of 70 oars dipping into the murky water, the faint strains of a string orchestra playing on the deck of a gilded galley named Dnieper, and the distant, rolling thunder of ceremonial cannon fire echoing from the riverbanks. The scene is a painter's dream, a vision of imperial power made manifest. Along the shore, impossibly perfect villages drift by, their cottages whitewashed and decorated with vibrant folk patterns, the sunlight glinting off newly glazed windows. Healthy, happy peasants in festive dress stand by the water's edge, waving and cheering as the flotilla passes, their voices carrying across the water in a chorus of adoration. The smell is a bizarre cocktail of river mud, damp wood, fresh paint, and the cloying perfume of the French court wafting from the imperial vessel. On board, beneath a silken canopy, sits the Empress of all the Russias, Catherine the Great, her face a mask of serene satisfaction. Beside her, his one good eye taking in the scene with a creator's pride, stands Prince Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin. He has orchestrated this entire reality. But for the foreign ambassadors on board, men like the Comte de Ségur of France and the Austrian Emperor Joseph II traveling incognito, a creeping sense of unease begins to settle in. It is all too perfect. The cattle are too plump, the villages too uniform, the joy of the peasants too theatrical. A whisper starts, a virus of an idea, that behind these beautiful facades there is nothing. That the moment the imperial galley rounds the bend, these smiling peasants will pack up their costumes and these portable villages will be dismantled, only to be reassembled further downstream. This single, powerful, and poisonous image of a grand deception will come to define the man who orchestrated it, eclipsing everything else he ever built. This is the narrative of him, Prince Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin Tavrichesky, the one-eyed cyclops of the Russian Empire, the lover, co-ruler, and grand architect of Catherine the Great's southern expansion. This was the saga of a man who conquered and colonized a territory the size of France, who founded cities that still stand today, who built a fleet from nothing that would challenge the Ottoman Porte, and who gifted his empress and lover a new kingdom, Novorossiya, the jewel of which was the Crimean Peninsula. His achievements were monumental, etched into the very map of Europe with the iron will of a conqueror and the grand vision of a dreamer. And yet, the verdict of history, particularly in the West, has been brutally simple. He was the master of the grand illusion, the man who built ghost towns. The very name Potemkin has become a synonym for any impressive facade designed to hide an unsavory or non-existent reality. The central dramatic paradox of his life is this monumental chasm between the very real empire he constructed and the legend of the ephemeral illusions he supposedly conjured. To understand this man, we must ask the core question that his story poses. How did a statesman of such tangible, earth-shaking accomplishments become the eternal symbol of magnificent fraud? Was his empire of illusions a cynical lie, a necessary tool of statecraft, a psychological projection of his own theatrical nature, or a black legend carefully crafted by his enemies to diminish a legacy too vast for them to comprehend? We must travel back to the world that forged this titan of contradictions to find the answer. To understand Potemkin, we must first return to the world of the mid-18th century, a brutal and unforgiving chessboard of shifting alliances and ravenous ambitions. This was not a world of stable borders and settled treaties. It was a cauldron of geopolitical Darwinism. In the West, the great powers of France and Great Britain were locked in their global struggle for colonial supremacy, their conflicts spilling across oceans and continents, while on the European mainland, a new, formidable power was rising in the form of Prussia under its philosopher king and military genius, Frederick the Great. His disciplined armies and ruthless statecraft were rewriting the rules of warfare and diplomacy, challenging the old dominance of the Austrian Habsburgs. To the south, the once mighty Ottoman Empire, the Sublime Porte, was what diplomats condescendingly called the sick man of Europe. Yet it was a sickness that could still prove fatal to its neighbors. The Porte still controlled the entire northern coast of the Black Sea, a strategic and economic chokehold that effectively rendered Russia a landlocked giant, its immense resources unable to easily reach the warm waters and lucrative trade routes of the Mediterranean. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a vast and chaotic aristocratic republic, was in a state of terminal decline, its internal paralysis making it a tempting prize for its powerful neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. It was a dying empire, and the vultures were circling. And then there was Russia, a colossal, sprawling empire stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, a land of immense potential and crushing backwardness. It was a giant just beginning to stir from a long slumber, its muscles flexed by Peter the Great a generation earlier. Now ruled by a German princess, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, who had remade herself as the quintessentially Russian autocrat, Catherine II. Her ambition was as vast as the empire she ruled, and she saw Russia's destiny lying to the south. Potemkin's place in this world was to be the primary instrument of that ambition, the man who would smash open the door to the Black Sea and drag Russia into the heart of European power politics. The origins of this imperial titan were anything but grand. Grigory Potemkin was born in 1739 in the provincial obscurity of the Smolensk region, into a family of minor landed gentry. His world was not one of gilded palaces, but of dusty country estates, the smell of manure, and the constant, grinding reality of being a small fish in a very large, aristocratic pond. This was his ancestral curse, noble blood without the wealth or connections to make it matter. His father was a retired army officer, a man of unremarkable talents and a difficult temper, who cast a long, but not particularly inspiring, shadow. It was his mother, Daria, who was the formative force in his life. Ambitious, domineering, and fiercely intelligent, she poured all her frustrated aspirations into her son. It was she who recognized the restless, chaotic brilliance simmering beneath his often lazy exterior. This upbringing forged in him a character of violent and spectacular contradictions. He was sent to the newly established Moscow University, a hotbed of Enlightenment ideas, where he proved to be a voracious and gifted student, mastering Greek, theology, and the classics. Yet, he was expelled, not for lack of intellect, but for a profound and characteristic indolence, a refusal to conform to academic discipline. He possessed a mind that could absorb vast amounts of information, but a temperament that resisted any form of external constraint. This duality would define his entire life. Periods of almost catatonic lethargy, where he would lie in his chambers for days, unkempt and melancholic, punctuated by bursts of titanic, world-altering energy. He was deeply, almost mystically, pious, a man who knew the Orthodox liturgy by heart and saw God's hand in history. Yet he was also a man of gargantuan sensual appetites, a legendary lecher whose affairs were the talk of the empire. He was the provincial boy who never forgot the sting of obscurity, and it was this memory that fueled his relentless drive to stun the world with the sheer scale of his deeds. The first step into the great game was not a heroic charge on the battlefield or a masterful speech in the Senate. It was a small, almost theatrical gesture, a moment of quick thinking that placed him directly in the gaze of power. The event was the palace coup of June 28, 1762, one of the defining moments of the 18th century Russian state. The reigning emperor, Peter III, a man of Prussian sympathies and erratic behavior, had alienated the two pillars of the Russian autocracy: the Orthodox Church, and more dangerously, the elite Imperial Guard regiments. His wife, Catherine, a German princess with no legitimate claim to the throne, seized her moment, conspiring with the guards to overthrow her husband. Grigory Potemkin, then a strapping, handsome, and charismatic junior officer in the Horse Guards, was merely one of many young men who had thrown their lot in with the ascendant Empress. As Catherine, dressed in the uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky regiment, prepared to ride out to lead the troops, a small detail threatened to mar the carefully constructed image of martial authority. The decorative sword knot, or temliak, was missing from her saber. It was a trivial thing, but in the high theater of a coup, symbols are everything. The chronicler reports that Potemkin, seeing the problem, spurred his horse forward, unfastened his own sword knot, and gallantly offered it to his new sovereign. In that brief moment, as he leaned in close to the Empress, their eyes met. She saw not just a loyal soldier, but a man of striking presence, confidence, and audacity. He had not won a battle, but he had captured the attention of the commander-in-chief. This single act, seemingly insignificant, was his entry point. He had placed himself on the stage, distinguishing himself from the crowd of other ambitious young officers like the powerful Orlov brothers who were the primary architects of the coup. He had made himself visible, and in the court of an absolute monarch, visibility was the currency of power. Beneath the surface of the ambitious courtier, the brilliant administrator, and the sensual hedonist, there lay a hidden, burning core. An inner demon, or perhaps more accurately, a secret motivation that was almost messianic in its scope. Potemkin's ambition was not merely for the conventional trappings of power, wealth, titles, and influence. He had all of those in abundance. His was a far grander, more audacious, and deeply personal dream, rooted in his profound Orthodox faith and his classical education. This was the Greek project. It was nothing less than the complete geopolitical reordering of Eastern Europe and the Levant. The project envisioned the final and total expulsion of the Ottoman Empire from European soil, the liberation of the Orthodox peoples of the Balkans, the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbs, from centuries of Turkish rule. The ultimate goal was the resurrection of the Byzantine Empire, with its capital not in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but in a reconquered Constantinople, the sacred city of Constantine, which the Russians called Tsargrad. In this grand vision, Catherine the Great would be the new Justinian, and a new Orthodox empire would rise from the ashes of the old. There was even a plan to place Catherine's second grandson, appropriately named Constantine, on the throne of this restored Byzantium. This was not just a political or military strategy. For Potemkin, it was a sacred duty, the culmination of Russian history, the fulfillment of Moscow's claim to be the Third Rome. This secret fire animated his every move in the south. Every fort built, every port dredged, every regiment raised, was a step towards Tsargrad. It explains the sheer scale and frantic pace of his colonization of Novorossiya. He was not just building a new province, He was constructing the logistical springboard for a holy war, the launching pad for the final crusade that would restore the cross to the Hagia Sophia. This almost mystical conviction was what separated him from the other, more pragmatic grandees of Catherine's court. They sought to serve the state. Potemkin sought to remake the world. The engine that would power this world-remaking ambition was forged not in a council of state, but in the crucible of one of history's great love affairs. The fateful encounter between Grigory Potemkin and Empress Catherine II evolved into an alliance that would define an era. While he had caught her eye during the coup of 1762, their relationship truly ignited over a decade later, in 1774. The evidence of their bond lies in their extraordinary correspondence, a collection of letters that are at once passionate, witty, strategic, and deeply personal. In these letters, they are not just monarch and subject. They are intellectual equals, strategic partners, and lovers who address each other with startling intimacy as my darling, my soul, and my golden pheasant. Catherine, a woman of formidable intellect and political acumen, had found in Potemkin more than just a physically magnetic favorite, a role others before him had filled. She had found her intellectual match, a man whose vision was as expansive as her own, whose energy, when roused, could move mountains. He was, as she called him, her colossus, her pupil, and her master. Their union was a fusion of the personal and the political. They were likely secretly married in a clandestine Orthodox ceremony, a fact that, if true, would elevate Potemkin from the status of a favorite to that of a consort, a prince husband. This bond gave him an unprecedented level of authority. He was not merely advising the Empress. He was her co-conspirator, the executive officer of their shared imperial dream. He understood her ambitions better than anyone, and she, in turn, trusted his judgment and his chaotic genius implicitly. This alliance completely reshaped the power dynamics of the Russian court. It allowed Potemkin to operate with a degree of autonomy that no other minister possessed, to command vast resources, and to pursue his grand southern strategy with the full, unwavering backing of the throne. Their love affair was the central nervous system of the Russian Empire for the better part of 2 decades, a partnership that was as productive as it was passionate, and it was this unique relationship that gave Potemkin the canvas on which to paint his masterpiece, a new Russia on the shores of the Black Sea. Following the consummation of his alliance with Catherine in 1774, Potemkin's ascent was no longer a gradual climb, but a vertical, explosive trajectory into the very stratosphere of power. The price of this power was the eternal jealousy of the court and the crushing weight of responsibility, but the rewards were almost limitless. Catherine showered him with titles, estates, and most importantly, authority. He was appointed vice president of the State War College, a position that gave him direct control over the reform and administration of the Russian army. He was made governor-general of the vast, newly acquired southern territories, which would be collectively known as Novorossiya, or New Russia. This was not a ceremonial role. He was a viceroy, a de facto king of the south, ruling over a territory that stretched from the Dniester to the Caucasus. In St. Petersburg, his position was unique and unprecedented. He was more than a favorite in the traditional sense, more than a temporary occupant of the Empress's bedchamber. He became, in essence, a co-ruler. While Catherine managed the grand strategy of the empire and its foreign policy in Europe, Potemkin became the master of the South, the single-minded executor of their shared imperial vision. The sheer concentration of power in his hands naturally bred resentment. The powerful Orloff brothers, who had been the architects of Catherine's coup, saw this provincial upstart eclipse them entirely. Other court grandees, men of ancient lineage and immense wealth, bristled at the authority wielded by this one-eyed Cyclops, as they derisively called him. They saw his extravagance, his moody temperament, and his unconventional style as a threat to the established order. But their intrigues were powerless against the unshakable bond between Potemkin and the Empress. He was the indispensable man, the only one with the vision, the energy, and the ruthlessness to undertake the monumental task of taming the wild field and confronting Russia's ancient southern foe. The power he wielded was absolute. The resources at his command were immense, and the stage for his life's work was now set. The primary antagonist in Potemkin's grand geopolitical drama, the dragon he was destined to slay, was not a person, but a sprawling, ancient, and formidable empire, the Ottoman Porte. For centuries, the Sublime Porte, ruling from Constantinople, had been the dominant power in southeastern Europe and the Black Sea region. To the Russian imagination, it was more than just a rival state. It was the heir to the Mongol Golden Horde, the infidel occupier of the sacred heartland of orthodoxy and the primary obstacle to Russia's destiny. The conflict was not merely about territory. It was a clash of civilizations, a long simmering religious and ideological struggle. The practical, strategic threat posed by the Ottomans was immense. They controlled the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the straits that were the only gateway from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. As long as this gateway was in hostile hands, Russia's southern flank was vulnerable, and its economic potential was strangled. The key to Ottoman power in the region was their vassal state, the Crimean Khanate. For centuries, the Crimean Tatars, descendants of the Mongol conquerors, had launched devastating slave raids, known as the harvesting of the steppe, deep into Russian and Ukrainian lands, carrying off hundreds of thousands of captives. The Khanate was a persistent bleeding wound on Russia's southern border, a source of instability that made any large-scale colonization of the fertile southern steppes impossible. Potemkin understood that to secure the south, he had to neutralize the Crimean Khanate, and to do that, he had to break the back of Ottoman sea power in the Black Sea. This was the great game. The Ottomans were not a monolithic or primitive foe. Their empire was vast, possessed a formidable military tradition, and could call upon immense resources. Slaying this dragon would require more than just brute force. It would demand a combination of military reform, diplomatic cunning, logistical genius, and unwavering resolve. This was the challenge that consumed Potemkin, the central conflict that shaped his entire career. Even for a man as favored by fortune as Potemkin, the path to power was not without its moments of crisis and despair. One such period, a true psychological breaking point, occurred in the aftermath of the First Russo-Turkish War, which concluded with the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca in 1774. While the war was a resounding victory for Russia, granting it its first small footholds on the Black Sea coast, and establishing the Crimean Khanate as nominally independent from the Ottomans. For Potemkin, the triumph was incomplete. His own grand vision for a sweeping conquest and the immediate establishment of a new Byzantine realm had not been realized. He had served in the war with distinction, but the final peace was a product of diplomacy and compromise, not the apocalyptic crusade he had envisioned. This sense of an unfinished task, combined with the brutal intrigues of the court and the immense psychological pressure of his relationship with Catherine, plunged him into a profound spiritual crisis. He experienced what can only be described as a severe bout of depression, a deep melancholy that was a recurring feature of his character. He felt sidelined, his grand project misunderstood. In a dramatic gesture, he withdrew from court life, shedding his glittering uniforms and accolades. He devoted himself to the study of theology, immersing himself in the writings of the Church Fathers, and according to some accounts, seriously contemplated renouncing the world and becoming a monk. This period of withdrawal was his fatal mistake, a miscalculation of courtly dynamics that allowed his rivals to whisper in the Empress's ear. But it was also a moment of profound personal transformation. In the quiet solitude of his theological studies, he came to a crucial realization. Power derived solely from the favor of a monarch was ephemeral and contingent. It could be given and taken away on a whim. True, lasting glory, the kind that echoed through eternity, came from monumental, tangible achievements. He understood that he needed to build something real, something that would outlast courtly fashions and his own mortality. It was this revelation that steeled his resolve. When he finally emerged from his seclusion, he was no longer just an ambitious courtier. He was a man with a historical mission. The opportunity for Potemkin to translate his newfound resolve into concrete action came not with a prestigious appointment in the glittering capital of St. Petersburg, but with a posting that many would have considered an exile. In 1774, Catherine appointed him Governor-General of Novorossiya, or New Russia. This was a colossal swathe of territory, a vast and untamed wilderness stretching along the northern coast of the Black Sea. For centuries, this region had been known as the Dikoye Polye, the wild field, a lawless, underpopulated no-man's land, a battleground between the Russian, Polish, and Ottoman empires, constantly raked over by the raids of the Crimean Tatars. It was a land of immense fertility and strategic importance, but it was also a desolate, dangerous, and chaotic frontier. For any other court grandee, this appointment would have been a political death sentence, a banishment far from the center of power and influence. But for Potemkin, it was the chance he had been waiting for. He understood that the chaos of the wild field was not a liability, but an opportunity. Here, far from the stifling protocol and incessant intrigues of the imperial court, he had a blank canvas. He could use this seeming exile to create his own kingdom, to build his imperial dream from the ground up, unencumbered by the dead weight of tradition and the jealousy of his rivals. He became the absolute ruler of this vast domain, a viceroy with near dictatorial powers. He saw the potential in the chaos. He realized he could use the lawlessness of the frontier to attract the bold and the desperate, colonists, soldiers, adventurers from every corner of Europe. He could turn this empty steppe into a thriving, militarized, and productive province, the logistical base for his ultimate ambition, the drive south to Constantinople. The wild field was to be his laboratory, the place where he would forge a new reality, and he seized the opportunity with the ferocious energy of a man who had glimpsed oblivion and returned with a singular purpose. The culmination of nearly a decade of patient, relentless, and often brutal work in the south arrived not with the thunder of cannons, but with the stroke of a pen. The single greatest triumph of Potemkin's career, the climax of the second act of his life, was the peaceful and bloodless annexation of the Crimean Khanate in 1783. For centuries, Crimea had been the linchpin of Ottoman power in the Black Sea and the primary source of Russian insecurity in the south. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca had made the Khanate nominally independent, but in reality, It remained a chaotic hornet's nest of pro-Turkish and pro-Russian factions. Potemkin understood that a direct military invasion would be costly and could provoke a full-scale war with the Ottomans before Russia was ready. So he orchestrated a masterpiece of what would today be called hybrid warfare. His strategy was a masterful blend of diplomacy, subversion, bribery, and intimidation. He poured vast sums of money into the pockets of key Crimean Tatar nobles, buying their loyalty and encouraging them to support the pro-Russian candidate for the throne, Jahangir. He fomented internal divisions, playing rival clans against each other. Simultaneously, he moved Russian troops to the borders of the Khanate and positioned his newly built Black Sea fleet off its coast, a constant and menacing reminder of Russian power. When the time was right, after years of manufactured chaos had exhausted the Tatar nobility, he presented them with an ultimatum: accept Russian annexation or face annihilation. On April 8, 1783, the last Crimean Khan abdicated, and the leading nobles swore an oath of allegiance to the Russian Empress. With that, the centuries-old threat was extinguished without a single major battle. Potemkin had delivered to Catherine the greatest strategic prize of her reign. As a reward, she bestowed upon him the victory title of Knyaz Tavricheski, Prince of Tauris, linking his name forever with the ancient Greek name for Crimea. The dream of a secure southern border and a warm water port was no longer a dream. It was a geopolitical reality. In the wake of his Crimean triumph, Potemkin's psychology entered a new and dangerous phase, the moment of hubris. To celebrate his victory and his new title, Prince of Tauris, he staged a festival in his St. Petersburg residence, the Taurid Palace, that was so extravagant, so breathtakingly opulent, that it became the stuff of legend. This was not merely a party. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle of power, a statement of his own unique place in the universe. Thousands of guests, including the entire imperial court and all foreign ambassadors, wandered through a vast winter garden created inside the palace, complete with winding paths, exotic trees, and crystal streams. An army of servants in lavish liveries served delicacies on solid gold and silver plates. The chronicler of the event, the poet Gavrila Derzhavin, described a scene of almost supernatural magnificence, a feast worthy of the gods of Olympus. In this moment, Potemkin saw himself not as a servant of the state, not even as a favorite of the Empress, but as a creator, a demiurge, a historical figure on par with the great conquerors and builders of antiquity. He had not just won a province. He had, in his mind, corrected a historical injustice, restored a lost piece of the classical world to a new Christian empire. He was consciously modeling himself on the heroes of Plutarch, men who shaped the destiny of nations. This sense of being an instrument of divine providence, of having a personal connection to the grand arc of history, imbued him with a feeling of invincibility. It was this hubris that would lead him to stage the famous Crimean journey of 1787, an act of supreme political theater designed to showcase his creation to the world. He believed his achievements were so real, so monumental, that they could not be denied. He had ceased to see the line between reality and representation, believing that his will alone was powerful enough to shape the perceptions of others. He was no longer just playing the great game. He believed he was directing it. While Potemkin saw himself as a hero of destiny, every epic requires a worthy adversary. His sworn enemy was not a single individual, but the sprawling, complex, and embattled leadership of the Ottoman Empire, personified by the reigning Sultan, Abdul Hamid I. To cast the Ottoman court as a monolithic force of evil or a cabal of incompetent despots is to miss the true nature of their drama. The Sublime Porte of the late 18th century was a declining but not yet defeated empire wrestling with profound internal crises. Abdul Hamid. I was not a bloodthirsty tyrant, but a deeply pious and relatively conscientious ruler who had inherited an empire beset by problems. He was faced with military defeats, a struggling economy, and the immense challenge of governing a vast, multi-ethnic state that was feeling the pressure of more dynamic and centralized European powers. His court was a viper's nest of factions. Conservative janissaries who resisted any attempt at military modernization, reform-minded viziers who understood the need for change, and powerful religious clerics who saw any Western-style innovation as a betrayal of Islam. They were not blind to the rising threat of Russia. They watched Potemkin's activities in Novorossiya with growing alarm, seeing the construction of new cities like Kherson and Sevastopol, and the creation of the Black Sea Fleet for what they were, a dagger pointed at the heart of their empire. Their drama was that of a proud and ancient power struggling to defend its legacy against a relentlessly aggressive and expansionist rival. They were forced to react to Potemkin's moves, often from a position of weakness. Potemkin's genius lay in his ability to exploit their internal divisions and their strategic vulnerabilities. The personal chemistry of this conflict was one of action and reaction, with Potemkin, the audacious innovator, constantly pushing and probing, and the Ottoman court, the cautious guardian of tradition, trying desperately to hold the line. While the legend of Potemkin would focus on the ephemeral villages, the true story of his time in the south is one of monumental and backbreaking construction. The task of colonizing Novorossiya was a Herculean undertaking, arguably the largest state-directed development project in 18th-century Europe. He was given a vast, fertile, but almost completely empty steppe, and his mandate was to turn it into a thriving, populated, and economically productive province. This was the real meat behind the theatrical illusion. First and foremost was the founding of cities. These were not ghost towns. They were strategic and administrative centers planned and built from scratch. In 1778, he founded Kherson at the mouth of the Dnieper, intended as the central fortress and the first shipyard for the new Black Sea Fleet. He founded Nikolaev, which would become the premier naval base and shipbuilding center of the entire Black Sea. After the annexation of Crimea, he established Sevastopol on the site of a natural harbor of breathtaking strategic value, destined to become one of the world's great naval ports. His most ambitious project was the city of Ekaterinoslav, Catherine's Glory, which he envisioned as the third capital of the Russian Empire, a new Athens of the South, complete with a university and a magnificent cathedral designed to rival St. Peter's in Rome. Alongside city building, he had to create a navy out of nothing. He imported shipwrights, sailors, and engineers, and within a few short years, a formidable Black Sea Fleet, the very instrument of Russian power, was riding at anchor in Sevastopol. To populate this vast land, he initiated a massive campaign of colonization, offering incentives that were almost unheard of at the time. He offered free land, tax exemptions, and crucially, religious freedom, attracting a diverse flood of settlers from across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Serbs, Germans, Greeks, Armenians, and even dissident Russian Old Believers flocked to Novorossiya, creating a unique multicultural frontier society. This was the solid foundation of his power, the tangible empire of brick, timber, and people that gave substance to his grand vision. Beyond the grand sweep of geopolitics and construction, The texture of Potemkin's life was woven from a complex tapestry of personal relationships, extravagant tastes, and deep spiritual convictions. This was the context, the onions and vegetables that gave his story its unique flavor. His personal life remained a whirlwind of organized chaos. After his passionate romance with Catherine cooled, he remained her closest friend and advisor, and a unique arrangement developed between them. He would vet and often select her new, younger lovers, ensuring that no new favorite could ever usurp his own unique position of power. He never married officially, but he surrounded himself with his young nieces, the Engelhart girls, 5 beautiful sisters whom he doted on, educated, and enriched. It was an open secret at court that his relationship with some of them, particularly the beautiful Varvara and Alexandra, went far beyond that of a typical uncle. And they were widely believed to be his mistresses and the mothers of his unacknowledged children. His lifestyle was a spectacle of calculated extravagance. He was a man of legendary appetites, known for his love of sterlet soup, fine wines, and lavish feasts. His personal court was a traveling circus of artists, architects, musicians, and officials. Yet this theatricality was also a tool of governance. His wealth and magnificence were designed to project an aura of immense power and success, to awe foreign dignitaries and inspire confidence in his colonial projects. He maintained a vast network of spies and agents throughout the Ottoman Empire and Europe, providing Catherine with intelligence that was second to none. Beneath it all was the bedrock of his Orthodox faith. He was genuinely devout, spending hours in prayer and discussion with clerics. He saw his work in Novorossiya not just as state-building, but as a holy mission. The creation of a new Jerusalem on the steppes, a beacon of orthodoxy on the frontier of the Muslim world. This blend of the sacred and the profane, the strategist and the sensualist, was the very essence of the man. Even at the zenith of his power, as he was building his new world in the south, the first cracks in the edifice began to appear. The harbingers of the storm were not Ottoman armies, but whispers in the gilded corridors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Potemkin's rivals at court, jealous of his unprecedented power and his intimate relationship with the Empress, launched a campaign of insinuation and slander against him. Their primary weapon was the accusation of corruption and waste. And indeed, the Novorossiya project was consuming a staggering portion of the imperial budget. Vast sums of money were being funneled south, and Potemkin's accounting practices were, to put it mildly, opaque. His enemies painted a picture of a colossal fraud, arguing that the Prince of Taurus was squandering the wealth of the empire on ill-conceived projects and lining his own pockets in the process. These whispers found fertile ground among fiscal conservatives at court, who were aghast at the expenditures. The critical moment came when these Russian rumors were given an official-sounding, international stamp of approval. Georg von Helbig, a secretary at the Saxon embassy in St. Petersburg, began sending home diplomatic dispatches filled with the most lurid and damning gossip about Potemkin's southern enterprise. It was he who, based on these second-hand court rumors, coined the immortal phrase Potemkin villages, Potemkinsche Dörfer. He described in vivid detail how Potemkin was allegedly deceiving the Empress with mobile villages and happy peasants, creating a theatrical illusion of prosperity. These reports were seized upon by Russia's rivals across Europe. The story was simply too good to be untrue. It perfectly captured the Western stereotype of Russia as a backward, Asiatic despotism, a land of bluff and deception. The myth of the grand illusion began to take root, a powerful narrative that was far more compelling than the complicated, messy reality of state building on the frontier. The irony was that this black legend was being born at the very moment that real cities were rising and a real fleet was being built. The grand Crimean journey of 1787 was Potemkin's fateful act, the ultimate expression of his hubris and the key decision that would trigger the finale of his life's work. It was an act of supreme confidence, a piece of political theater on an unprecedented scale, designed to achieve multiple objectives at once. His primary goal was to showcase his monumental achievements to his Empress and lover, Catherine. He wanted her to see with her own eyes the fruits of the immense treasure she had invested in him and his projects. He wanted to silence his critics in St. Petersburg once and for all by confronting them with the undeniable reality of his new Russia. But his audience was not just domestic. He purposefully invited a host of foreign ambassadors, including the influential French and Austrian envoys, as well as the Austrian Emperor Joseph II himself. He wanted to demonstrate to the great powers of Europe that Russia was now a formidable Black Sea power, a new and crucial player in the Eastern question. Finally, and most provocatively, the journey was a message to the Ottoman Porte. It was a victory lap on conquered territory, a spectacular display of military and naval strength designed to intimidate the Sultan and solidify Russia's claim to Crimea. The psychology behind this decision was that of a creator deeply proud of his work and utterly convinced of its substance. He believed the reality, the new cities, the fledgling fleet, the settled lands, was so powerful that it could be enhanced, not negated, by a bit of theatricality. He saw no contradiction in tidying up the route, erecting triumphal arches, and staging folkloric displays for his guests. In his mind, this was not deception. It was stage management, the proper presentation of a great historical achievement. He had become so invested in his own creation myth that he failed to appreciate how this magnificent spectacle could be perceived by his enemies not as a celebration of peace, but as a prelude to war. The Crimean journey was, from Potemkin's perspective, a spectacular and unqualified success. The Empress was delighted, the foreign dignitaries were suitably impressed, and his rivals at court were, for the moment, silenced. But in geopolitics, one nation's triumph is often another's catastrophe. The very success of the journey became the trigger for the greatest disaster of Potemkin's career, the outbreak of the Second Russo-Turkish War in August 1787. For the Ottoman court in Constantinople, the spectacle unfolding on their former territory was not just an insult, it was an existential threat and an intolerable provocation. Ottoman spies reported every detail of the journey: the massive military escorts, the launch of new warships at Kherson, and the review of the powerful Black Sea Fleet at its new home in Sevastopol. The final, unforgivable spark was a triumphal arch erected for Catherine to pass under in Kherson, which bore the audacious inscription, "The Way to Byzantium." The message could not have been clearer. Potemkin's Greek project was not a secret fantasy. It was now the openly declared policy of the Russian Empire. This was a direct challenge that the Ottoman Sultan, under pressure from the war hawks in his court, could not ignore. To do so would be a sign of terminal weakness, an invitation for further Russian aggression. So in August, the Sublime Porte issued an ultimatum to Russia, demanding the restoration of Crimea and the withdrawal of its forces. When the ultimatum was rejected, they declared war. This was a war that Potemkin had not wanted, at least not yet. His grand strategy had been to continue building his strength in the south, to consolidate his gains, and to wait for a more opportune moment to strike. But his own theatrical triumph, His act of supreme hubris had forced his enemy's hand. The journey designed to celebrate the peaceful acquisition of an empire had, with cruel irony, plunged that empire into a long, bloody, and difficult war. The outbreak of the war thrust Potemkin into a new and unfamiliar role. The creator and administrator now had to be the commander-in-chief, and the transition was a catastrophic psychological and political collapse. The focal point of the early war was the formidable Ottoman fortress of Ochakov, which controlled the mouth of the Dnieper Bug estuary and blocked the sea route to his newly built city of Kherson. Capturing it was a strategic necessity. Potemkin laid siege to the fortress in the summer of 1788 with a massive Russian army. But the siege quickly bogged down into a brutal, bloody stalemate. The Ottoman defense was ferocious, and the Russian attacks were repeatedly repulsed. The Prince of Taurus, the man of boundless energy and decisive action, suddenly became paralyzed by indecision and despair. He was overcome by one of his recurring bouts of deep, debilitating depression. He vacillated, refusing to order a decisive final assault, hoping to starve the fortress into submission. Meanwhile, the Russian army, camped in the open steppe as autumn turned to a vicious winter, began to disintegrate. Disease, typhus, and scurvy ran rampant through the camps, killing soldiers by the thousand. The army suffered terribly from the cold and lack of supplies. Potemkin's authority began to crumble. His best generals, particularly the brilliant and aggressive Alexander Suvorov, were openly critical of his lethargy and indecisiveness, begging for permission to storm the fortress. The creator who had dreamed of founding a new Athens was now bogged down in the frozen mud outside a Turkish fort, watching his army die around him. The prescriptions of his rivals in St. Petersburg grew louder. They accused him of incompetence and cowardice. This was his darkest hour, the moment his grand vision collided with the brutal, messy reality of war. The siege of Ochakov was his last chance to prove himself as a great military commander, and by all accounts, he was failing. The fortress was eventually taken by a desperate and bloody assault led by Suvorov, but the victory was Pyrrhic, and Potemkin's reputation as an invincible titan was shattered. The final scene of this epic life was not played out in a gilded palace or on a victorious battlefield, but on the vast, empty, and desolate steppe that had been the canvas of his life's work. The war with the Ottoman Empire eventually turned in Russia's favor, thanks largely to the brilliance of generals like Suvorov and admirals like Ushakov. Potemkin, as commander-in-chief, presided over the peace negotiations in Jassy, the capital of Moldavia. He had secured a treaty that solidified all of his gains, pushing the Russian border to the Dniester River. He had won, but he was a broken man. The years of relentless work, the immense stress of the war, and his own gargantuan appetites had taken their toll. During the negotiations, he was struck down by a virulent fever, likely malaria, which he had contracted in the swampy southern lands. Racked with fever and premonitions of his own death, he became obsessed with one final journey. He refused to die in a foreign land. He commanded his entourage to take him south, back to his creation, to his city of Nikolaev. On the 5th of October, 1791, his carriage was traveling across the bleak Moldavian steppe. His condition worsened dramatically. Gasping for air, he ordered them to stop the carriage and lay him on the ground. His aides spread a cloak on the dry grass, and there, under the vast, indifferent sky, with the autumn wind sighing around him, Prince Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin Tavrichesky, the creator of New Russia, died. It was a profoundly symbolic and lonely end for a man who had built cities and moved armies. He did not die in the arms of his Empress, or surrounded by the splendors of his court. He died in the middle of the wilderness he had tried to tame, his final journey unfinished, a titan laid low not by an enemy's sword, but by the microscopic workings of a mosquito, a humble agent of the very nature he had sought to conquer. The legacy of Grigory Potemkin is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a stark illustration of how history is written by the victors, and how a powerful myth can overwhelm a complex reality. In the West, his name became almost entirely synonymous with the legend of the Potemkin villages. The story, born of court gossip and amplified by foreign diplomats, was simply too perfect a metaphor for what many in Europe wanted to believe about Russia. It encapsulated the idea of Russian power as a bluff, a facade, an Asiatic deception. Enlightenment philosophers and, later, 19th-century historians seized upon the image, turning Potemkin into a caricature, the quintessential corrupt and deceptive Oriental vizier. He became a shorthand for Russian backwardness, authoritarianism, and untrustworthiness. The term entered the political lexicon of dozens of languages, forever cementing his reputation as the Prince of Illusion. In Russia, however, a completely different narrative took hold. Here, he is remembered not as a trickster, but as one of the great statesmen of the 18th century, a titanic figure who completed the work of Peter the Great. He is the man who secured Russia's southern frontier, who crushed the centuries-old threat of the Crimean Tatars, who founded the key cities of Kherson, Nikolaev, Sevastopol, and Ekaterinoslav, and who, from nothing, created the Black Sea Fleet. For Russian historians and patriots, the story of the villages is seen for what it largely was: a black legend, a calumny invented by jealous rivals and amplified by hostile foreigners who could not comprehend or accept the reality of Russia's sudden emergence as a major European power on the Black Sea. This chasm in perception persists to this day. Was he the visionary empire builder or the master of the fraudulent spectacle? The truth, as is so often the case, is lost somewhere in the space between these two irreconcilable legacies. So we return to the central dramatic paradox. How did the man who built a real empire become the eternal symbol of the grand illusion? The final comprehensive answer is that Potemkin was not a fraud, but rather a producer, the grand impresario of an immense political spectacle, who understood, centuries ahead of his time, that in the game of nations, perception is a form of power. The Potemkin villages, to the extent that they existed at all, were never intended to be a substitute for reality. The reality was the back-breaking, expensive, and time-consuming work of building actual cities, fleets, and farms. The famous facades and staged celebrations during the Crimean journey were not a lie meant to hide nothing. They were a form of political advertising, a theatrical flourish designed to accelerate reality. They were a marketing campaign. For his domestic audience, the Empress and his rivals, they were meant to showcase progress and justify the immense expenditure. For his foreign audience, the European ambassadors and the Ottoman Turks, they were a tool of psychological warfare, a projection of overwhelming strength and success meant to intimidate and impress. He was operating in the world of 18th century absolutism, a world that was inherently theatrical, where the power of the monarch was expressed through ritual, spectacle, and magnificence. Potemkin simply applied this principle to the field of colonial administration. The ghost towns were a temporary, and in the grand scheme of things, minor part of a much larger strategy. He was, in essence, pioneering a form of statecraft that understood the power of narrative. The reason the myth of the illusion overtook the fact of the empire is twofold. First, it was a story created and promoted by his political enemies, both inside and outside Russia, who had a vested interest in diminishing his staggering achievements. Second, the story was simply more compelling, more memorable, and more in line with preconceived Western notions about Russia. Potemkin wasn't broken by his enemies or by fate. His tangible legacy was simply overshadowed by a more powerful and enduring fiction that he himself, through his love of spectacle, had inadvertently helped to create. The verdict of history, when viewed from a distance, reveals that the saga of Grigory Potemkin is more than just the story of a flawed and brilliant man. It is a universal lesson on the very nature of empire and the process of creation itself. His life demonstrates that the act of building something truly new, of imposing a human order on a chaotic wilderness, is always a precarious blend of brute force, grand vision, and calculated illusion. Potemkin's great insight was that to make a dream a reality, you must first get others to believe in the dream as if it were already real. You must project an image of success and inevitability to attract the investment, the colonists, and the political will needed to actually achieve success. He was the ultimate practitioner of fake it till you make it on a geopolitical scale. He understood that empires are not built on foundations of brick and mortar alone. They are also built on foundations of belief, confidence, and fear. The narrative of power is as important as the instruments of power. He was not merely conquering the steppe, he was trying to write a new history for it, to superimpose a narrative of classical destiny and orthodox triumph onto a land of nomads and raiders. His story teaches us that all great acts of creation, whether in art, in business, or in statecraft, require a leap of faith, an element of bluff, the audacity to present a vision of the future with such conviction that it begins to materialize in the present. He was a pioneer, and the work of a pioneer is always messy, always a mix of the sublime and the squalid, the real and the imagined. The empire he built was not an illusion, but he proved that sometimes illusions are a necessary tool to build an empire. The final frame. The camera glides slowly, high above the deep, protected bays of a modern city. We see the white limestone buildings clinging to the hillsides, the grand neoclassical columns of naval museums, the Orthodox cathedral with its gleaming golden dome. We see warships, sleek and gray, anchored in the harbor, a potent symbol of military might. This is Sevastopol. The city is real. The port is real. The fleet is real. The millions of people who live in the lands he colonized are real. The geopolitical reality that he created, a dominant Russian presence on the Black Sea, has shaped the course of European history for more than 2 centuries and continues to do so to this day. All of this is the tangible, undeniable legacy of the one-eyed prince from the Smolensk backwoods. Then, for a moment, superimposed over the modern naval vessels, we see a ghostly image, a gilded, ornate galley, its silken canopy fluttering in the breeze. The faint sound of a string orchestra plays a minuet from a long-dead century. The shadow of his imperial journey still glides on these waters, a phantom presence that serves as a final, haunting reminder. It is a reminder that sometimes the most enduring realities, the ones etched into the very map of the world, must first be born from the most audacious, the most magnificent, and the most misunderstood of illusions. 140.2s